Train drawing near, a moment of chaos, the ending unclear. With his horse gone lame, his carelessness to blame, he'll have to wait at the Impassible Strait.
In Capitulo 84, the leadership of Estolia chose to invest heavily in rail transportation. Having made this monumental decision, and having laid down the appropriate island-wide infrastructure, they were thoroughly disinclined to alter the landscape to accommodate motorcars a mere 50 years later, upon the ascension of the crown in 1928. Every capitulo since, the council has considered, and ultimately discarded, the idea of accommodating automobiles. When international air travel became popular in the 1950s, the nation did install a modest airfield, seeing to the rigorous training of pilots in both fixed-wing and rotary-wing aircraft. Yet, aside from the few necessary support vehicles confined strictly to the tarmac, Estolia remains, to this day, a nation whose transportation is handled almost exclusively by equestrian or rail, with air reserved for limited support needs. Serenity Barlow Zakarian, Term Paper, December 11, 2002.
It was not quite dawn the next day when Antonio began saddling Lulu, his mare. He picked up one of her feet to inspect the hoof and shoe when a friendly voice hailed him. Setting her foot down, he straightened and saw Corbin approaching Gamin's home. He sat astride a soot-colored mare, pure and Estolian, and led two animals.
I am glad to find you still here,
Corbin said. Once he dismounted, he led the two unsaddled animals over to where Antonio was waiting.
I had the opportunity last night after you retired to speak at length with Gammon. We are agreed that it makes little sense for me to keep Rigo here. It is clear the white coat runs strong in his blood. He and Mimi here are twins, and they are just reaching 5 years of age.
Mimi was soot-colored, but the color surrounding her eyes and along her shoulders and flanks looked like it had been erased. He recognized the signs.
She will be white within the next year,
he said thoughtfully.
Will you bring both back to the palace? Perhaps Mimi will be a perfect mount for the new queen, or her progeny might carry the future king.
Antonio's shoulders loosened. He had not been certain the previous evening that his solution was equitable. Gamin had lost more than foals, a year of production, bloodlines, the goodwill of distant clients. The remuneration would make him whole, and the foals would serve the palace. Yet Corbin had borne too little of the burden. Now, with these two animals added, the scales balanced. He accepted the lead reins from Corbin, and less than an hour later, he was heading toward the southern shore of Corlia. There were several hours to go before he would stop for his midday repast when he began crossing the narrow rail bridge over the Impassible Strait, riding Lulu and leading Mimi and Rigoberto behind him. If he continued straight on, he would be home for the evening meal. The thought of writing to Laura warmed him. Lulu whinnied loudly, cutting the thought short. At the same instant, a metallic clang rang out. He glanced over his shoulder and saw something bounce off the rocks with a visible splash in the shallow water. The tide was out. He could see the glint of a horseshoe. Muttering imprecations, he swung out of the saddle. Lulu turned her head and looked at him, as if to ask him what they would do now. He looked from her to the other two horses. Mimi was Andestolian and Rigo a Corlian cross. He did not even know whether Mimi was trained for a rider. The visible steam cloud of an approaching train indicated that he would need to act quickly. There was plenty of room on the bridge for both the horses and the train, but he did not want to risk remaining in close quarters with horses he did not know well enough. He swung back into the saddle, grimacing, and urged Lulu toward the end of the bridge. Better to take her down over the ridge shoulder toward the coast than risk the train spooking animals he did not know. They were just nearing the rocky beach when he heard the train crossing the bridge. 5 or 6 mayberry trees formed a semicircle next to a lush meadow. He had camped in this place on his way to Corlia. He would consider his options once he unpacked his supplies. An hour later, he was sipping a hot beverage he made over the campfire. There was a chill in the air. It was almost November, mid-Aliforth by the old Estolian calendar. For now, the three horses were grazing in the small blind canyon that made this such a convenient stopping point. A rope or a lead rein strung across the gap was all it took to keep the horses penned in the small canyon. A freshwater spring, one of many in Estolia, bubbled up from the depths. There was even a small cave that could provide shelter from the elements in stormy weather. Once the horses were settled and he had his warm drink, he set out to retrieve the horseshoe. Easier said than done. More than an hour later, he shaded his eyes and looked up at the bridge, then glanced around the area. This was the spot where he saw the shoe come to rest in the shallow waters. The tide had turned. He closed his eyes, trying to picture the exact moment. A small cluster of saplings had deflected the falling shoe, and one branch had waved like a hand, pointing to where it fell. When he opened his eyes, he immediately located the saplings. Several leaves hung half-torn. Following that branch's angle, he located the small, shallow area, though the tide was coming in. This was where the shoe should be, but no matter how carefully he looked, he could not find anything at all. He would have to return when the tide was fully out. When he returned to the blind canyon, Lulu lifted her head and whinnied before approaching him. She was limping. Guilt swept over him. He never finished inspecting her feet that morning when Corbin interrupted him. This was his fault. He ran his hands along her left foreleg and felt the heat of a strain. He led her out to the rocky beach and into the water. The cold brought her relief. He could see it in the way she stood. He had planned to lead all three horses back to the palace. Now they would need to remain until she healed, and it was safe for her to travel. It was a week before she could walk without limping, almost 10 days before she seemed fully recovered. He flagged a traveler on the road to the palace and gave him a message for his family, explaining his delay and promising his return. His father could ask deity if he was very concerned, but Antonio recalled one of his father's instructions to both Samuel and himself.
Never use the gifts given to you in a frivolous fashion. You will be able to speak direct to deity and listen to the words of the Spirit whispering to your soul. But it is not a source you should seek frequently or for minor matters. It is there to help you when other methods either have not or cannot help or work.
Thoughts about his training as an acolyte brought Sam's flashing smile back to him. The family called them Samuel and Antonio, but the two boys had always been the best of friends and were Sam and Tony only to each other. When he was ready to begin the journey to the palace, he had Lulu carry only her saddle. Rigo and Mimi took the rest of his supplies. All four of them would walk slowly to the palace, even if it took 2 or 3 more days. Once they began the slow walk, Antonio stopped every mile or so to allow the horses to graze and to check Lulu's leg for renewed heat.
The bridge was narrow, the morning cold. A shoe is thrown, then lost in the tide. The steam of the engine, the train drawing near. A moment of chaos, the ending